You're looking at a farmhouse that's in pretty bad shape. Even so, it's much better off than the house that Maggie and Mrs. Johnson live in. This is Professor George, and I'd like to spend the next few minutes and 2 lectures discussing point of view in everyday use by Alice Walker. Specifically, I'd like to begin by defining point of view. Then I'll discuss the 4 kinds of narration, including special cases. I'll identify 2 questions that you should ask about point of view in any short story. I'll provide a plot summary of everyday use, and finally we'll conclude with an extended discussion of narration in everyday use. And that discussion is in part 2 of the lecture. If you're a parent, imagine this scenario. You're driving along with 2 children in the back seat, and all of a sudden you hear a slapping sound and crying. "What's going on back there?" you probably ask. "He hit me," she says. "No," interrupts the other, "she hit me first." "No," denies the first child, "he hit me first." Sound familiar? Who do you believe? Sometimes it's hard to know. This scenario applies to fiction too. A very important element to consider in analyzing a short story is point of view, also called narration. Point of view refers to who is telling the story and how much they know about the events of the plot. Point of view is important because it allows us to critically think about the extent to which we believe that we've been told the whole story. As the car scene with the child illustrates, 2 people can have the same experience and yet perceive that experience differently. Each person has his or her own point of view. So as a reader, we have to be sensitive to this fact in order to discover the truth of a story. In fiction, there are 4 common types of narration, and a short story typically maintains 1 point of view. The first type is a first-person narrator. A first-person narrator is a participant in the events of a story. So we see the pronoun I within that story. This narrator could be a major character, such as Mama in everyday use, or she may be a minor character who is relating the events. The limitation of a first-person narrator is that he or she can only relate events that he or she sees. A first-person narrator can't tell us what another character thinks. A first-person narrator can't tell us what happens outside of his or her sight. The remaining 3 kinds of narration are all third-person narrators, so called because this narrator is not a character in the story. Therefore, that narrator refers to characters as he, she, or they, third-person pronouns. The second kind of narrator, then, is a third-person objective narrator. This kind of narrator is essentially a reporter. He or she does not enter the thoughts of any character. He merely describes events from the outside and leaves the reader to infer the character's thoughts and feelings. Think about the nursery rhyme Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. This story is told by a third-person objective narrator. We know the events of the story. 2 people went up a hill because they wanted to get some water, but we don't know their feelings or thoughts. A slightly more informative narrator is a third-person limited narrator. This is, again, a narrator who is not a character in the story, but who sees through the eyes and mind and heart of a single character. With a third-person limited narrator, we know what one character thinks and what that character feels, but we don't know what the other characters feel and think. The most informative narrator of all is the third-person omniscient or all-knowing narrator. This is a narrator who knows and tells us what all the characters think and feel. But even this point of view has its limitations and advantages because the author has to manage a multitude of perspectives. We've talked about the 4 kinds of narrators, but there are other ways to evaluate narration too. In some cases, the narration doesn't really fall into any of these 4 categories. Modern writers in particular have experimented with various strategies for narration. One such strategy is stream of consciousness. Have you ever been bored in a class and your mind began to wander? Maybe you started thinking about errands you needed to run or things you needed to pick up from the grocery store, or people you needed to call. In literature, that way of thinking is called stream of consciousness. In stream of consciousness, the writer presents a character's thoughts and senses in a random fashion, just as they occur to that character. Stream of consciousness writing usually occurs in only a small part of a short story. A second departure is known as the interior monologue. This is like stream of consciousness, but more orderly and less random. It's arranged as if the character were speaking out loud to himself and we are able to overhear. If you've ever watched soap operas, you've seen this strategy in action. Sometimes a reader must decide whether the narrator's account should be accepted. We may notice a discrepancy between what the narrator tells us and what the author means for us to believe. One situation in which this discrepancy exists is with an innocent or naive narrator. We see this particularly with young or inexperienced narrators. They simply don't understand the implications of the story. In other words, the narrator doesn't completely get it, but we, the readers, do. This discrepancy also exists with an unreliable narrator. A narrator may be considered unreliable if that person is deceptive, deluded, mentally challenged, or even self-deceptive. In William Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury, the story is told by Benji, a grown man who is retarded. Therefore, his understanding of events is obviously muddled. In contrast, in Edgar Allan Poe's narrator in The Cask of Amontillado, the narrator is clearly deranged, having locked a man in a vault in a basement because he felt the man insulted him. Although it would take a deranged person to do such a thing, we do believe that Montresor is telling the truth as he lies on his deathbed. In this case, the narrator is an unbalanced but reliable narrator. In summary, when we analyze point of view and narration, we ask ourselves two questions. First, who is telling this story? Second, should I trust this narrator? Finally, remember that point of view, like all elements, is not a coincidence. Stories can be told from many points of views, by every character in the story, or even by an outsider. And writers make a conscious and deliberate choice when deciding who will narrate the story. By using a particular point of view, a writer can decide what information to tell us, what information to withhold, and what information to merely imply. To find out how point of view operates in Alice Walker's everyday use, please listen to part 2 of this lecture. Thank you.